Blog Talk. Welcome to the Susan Murphy Milano Show. Each week we cover the issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, marital rape, self-defense, cold cases, murder, religious beliefs, and suffering with abuse, trauma, and stalking, with experts from around the globe and often the victims and their families looking for information and answers to their questions. If you have questions, the number to call in is 347-326-9337, or email us at any time with questions and show suggestions, or if you would like to be considered as a guest, the email address is murphymilano@gmail.com. This is Delilah from Imagine Publicity, and our guest host for the month of October while Susan is on the road is Sandra L. Brown, who is the CEO of the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and Public Psychopathy Education. She is a psychopathologist, program development specialist, lecturer, and an award-winning author. Her books include the award-winning Women Who Love Psychopaths, Inside the Relationships of Inevitable Harm with Psychopaths, Sociopaths and Narcissists, as well as How to Spot a Dangerous Man Before You Get Involved, and Counseling Victims of Violence, a handbook for helping professionals. Sandra is recognized for her pioneering work on women's issues related to relational harm with Cluster B, Axis 2, Sociopathy, Psychopathy disordered partners. She specializes in the development of pathological love relationship clinical training and survivor support services. Her books, CDs, DVDs, and other training materials have been used as curriculum in drug rehabs, women's organizations and shelters, women's jail and prison programs, school and college-based programs, inner-city projects, and various psychology and sociology programs, and distributed in almost every country of the world. Her website is www.saferelationshipsmagazine.com. Hello, Sandra.
Thank you, Delilah. It's so good to be here for the month of October. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and so the Institute brings a unique twist to the issue of domestic violence, in which we are going to be looking at pathology and its effect not only on domestic violence and the quality of relationships that it impacts, but also how pathology affects our worldview. It affects the very culture and society that we live in, which is how we're going to kickstart this month of October, is talking about the cultural and political aspects of pathology in our world today. And so our guest joining us today is Harrison Koehli. He's an editor for Red Pill Press and publisher of Dr. Andrew Lobachevsky's book on pathology and power called Political Honorology. He's also an editor and sometimes contributor to the Dot Connector magazine, and writes on politics and psychopathy for the alternative news website, SOTT.net. And he also writes for us at the Institute at Safe Relationships magazine. So Harrison, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sandra. It's great to be on your show.
Yes. Well, today we're gonna try to dive in and kind of lay the groundwork today, you and I talking about the issues of pathology and what we mean by that, and kind of how pathology affects our world today. So you want to jump in? Tell me your thoughts on the concept of pathology, what we're talking about when we use that word.
Well, what we're talking about when we mention pathology, if you just look at the word, it means sickness. So we're looking at a type of sickness, a type of human psychology that is not normal. And the way that manifests itself in relationships with other people is that it's often what causes anything that we think of as a problem between people, between groups. So it can be anything from violence, physical, emotional, that kind of abuse, to the kind of subtle manipulations that eat people and cause them to be depressed. That's when you can have a toxic boss who what he's doing, what he or she is doing to you, other people might look at it and say, oh, that's not very nice. But for some people, the people with a pathology like psychopathy, they can spot a person's weaknesses and just exactly what will get them to tick, and they will wear that person down. And so it's really this insidious thing that goes on between people, and it's largely not noticed. Most people will suffer these kinds of things happening to them, suffer these people, and not really understand where it's coming from, why it's happening, who these people really are, and they'll just suffer from it without knowing the source.
Yes, exactly. Which is why the Institute had gotten involved in that whole concept about public pathology education, because there's just, we don't teach this. We don't teach it in graduate school, and we certainly don't even teach it on a public level, how to spot this or what pathology is. And I think our country suffers from too much Oprah, where everything is treatable and curable. And, at the root of pathology, and I think why pathology is so often rejected by people and even survivors until they really understand it, is that we believe all things are curable. That's what I mean kind of by that, that Oprahism, that we accept it in medicine. We don't have an answer. We don't have a cure for AIDS. We don't have a cure for cystic fibrosis. But by God, in psychology, we have the hardest time accepting that. And so that whole cluster of disorders that, we kind of associate with pathology, the cluster B personality disorders with narcissism and antisocial and the sociopaths and the psychopaths, that whole cluster, we just don't have successful treatment for. So, that whole issue of pathology, I think it is where we get stuck. Do you find that
Sandra,
to be true?
Could you and Harrison explain, just like he was talking about before, where a person is up against another person that has the pathological or is a pathological or has these, and you're the one that doesn't, so you don't understand where this is coming from, and I'm sure some people think that it's them and not the other person. Can you go through for the listeners like some of the signs that so-called normal people, whatever that might be, would see in a pathological? How are they able to, what buttons are they pushing and how are they doing it? And how would you recognize that the other person is the one that's causing this to happen within yourself?
Harrison, you want to jump in there?
Well, I'll mention a few things. You can interrupt me if you think I'm missing anything.
Okay.
But some of the most obvious things, I think, are, well, for one, is that people with extreme pathologies do not and never will take responsibility for anything. It's always somebody else's fault, and they'll always find a scapegoat, someone to blame, circumstances. And just as a funny, well, not so funny anecdote, in one of the last interviews Ted Bundy gave, he was talking about he really put on a pity ploy, a pity me show, and he was saying that, oh, you know what did this to me? Society did this to me. When I was growing up, I developed an extreme pornography addiction, and that stuff just ruins men's lives and stuff. And so he was portraying himself as this victim of society and pornography, which is a total lie. And he was, and it was really interesting to watch that, because there he was, and he was manipulating the guy that was interviewing him. I can't remember. It was a famous interviewer.
Dr. James Dobson.
Yeah. And so he's just playing this guy, and that's one of the things. And it's pretty noticeable once you start looking for it, is that nothing they do is their fault. And the way it happens is that, like, let's say in a work situation or something like that, where you'll have a pretty good idea that this person screwed up or did something wrong, and it'll be pretty clear to you in your mind while you see it happening. Then let's say you confront the person, or someone else confronts them, and they've got this perfectly good excuse, and it happens so repeatedly that you start doubting your own perceptions and start believing this guy, like, oh, well, maybe it's true. And what compounds the issue is that we have this hard time believing that people have this capacity to lie. It's like, well, because if you put yourself in that situation, well, I'd take responsibility. I'd feel guilty, I'd feel remorse, but it just slides right off them, so that everything is somebody else's fault. And why should they feel bad about it? They have no reason to feel bad about it, because it's absolutely not their fault. And so
there's a question in the chat room that kind of goes along with the lie. You're talking about how they lie. They want to know if you see pathological liars the same as compulsive liars, and do compulsive liars come to believe their own lies because lying is so easy for them? Or would that be one and the same?
It could be one and the same. I mean, given that most people know what pathological lying means, the whole pathological part of their behavior, all of that is fairly consistent. Pathological lying means that they will always lie. That given between telling the truth or telling a lie, and there's no consequence for either one of them, they'll still choose to lie as a way of having power, power and control over someone else's emotions and reality. And so, yes, that's the ongoing thing. Do they believe their own BS? Women want to know that. The survivors want to know that all the time. Does he really believe his own lies? And Harrison, I think the literature talks pretty much about this, if I'm correct, that they do know the difference between right and wrong.
Yeah. They know the difference between right and wrong, and they know they have some conception of what a fact is. Like, they know they're lying when they're lying. Now, the thing is that while they know that they're lying, the strange thing, and the thing that's really hard to wrap your head around, is that they have a totally different conception of the truth. Because for normal people who have, like, a functioning, emotional system that works, in their mind, the truth has this what I think of as, like, this emotional component. Like, when you want to know something, you want to know the truth, right? Well, I don't want to know. Like, if you're trying to find something out, no, I don't think anyone actively tries to find out something that is not true to believe in, right? So we have this kind of this pull towards the truth that I think is a very, like, deeply entrenched part of ourselves. And yet, for a psychopath, all facts are, like, all the truth is, it's just like a tool in his toolbox of manipulation. So if he's got a certain fact, he can take it out of his box and use it if he can get something out of it. But if that fact won't work in a certain situation, he'll just make one up, and it'll have an equal value to him. So it's just another. What's that?
Yeah, everything is a tool, or as we say, a weapon in their hand. Anything. The women's traits. One of the things that the Institute studied was the super traits, or the elevated temperament traits that these women have. Really high empathy, really high tolerance, and while it makes them the wonderful people that they are, even the temperament traits become weapons or tools in their hands. So truth or really anything that they can twist can be utilized. And I think that best way, at least from my perspective, from the work that the Institute has done, that often the best place to be able to identify pathology is in personal and intimate relationships. I think that's where the behavior really gets crystallized because people know them at a deeper level, whereas sometimes in the workplace it can almost take longer to be able to identify those behaviors. And Harrison, you guys have written and talked about this, that in the workplace, a lot of times they're in the environments that actually reward that behavior, so they hide well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the kind of traits that they have. Now, Paul Babiak and Robert Hare talk about this in their book Snakes in Suits. The traits that they have are the ones that are often actively sought out in employees. But the thing is that the traits that they're looking for, they only find their kind of caricatures in psychopaths. So while an employer might be looking for someone that needs to deal well in high stress situations. Now, so they'll see a psychopath, and a psychopath is as cool as a cucumber, because they really feel no anxiety. So this can look like a great thing, and they're charming, they're good with people, they're assertive, all these things, but really all these traits are just symptoms of an underlying pathology, which is a total, complete narcissism, a total, all of that is just focused around their sense of self, and they're getting what they need, and no one else matters in that. And so yeah, employers might hire them thinking they're great, but then inevitably what happens, like it always happens, is that these people will end up victimizing their coworkers, using people, and they will destroy lives, destroy careers, and when they're done with it, oftentimes, it's like this hurricane has come through the room, but no one's seen it, no one knows what happened. It's just like, whoa, what just happened?
Yeah. And and by nature, some of their levels of aggression, especially in business, are rewarded in certain job categories. So they slide in, mix well, and climb up, the corporate ladder on someone else's back.
And would you say too, Sandra, that there might be people, let's say, in a situation where there's a lot of other people involved around this person, whether they work under him or work above him, but some people might get it and some people don't, and therefore, the ones that do get it are kind of looked down upon or frowned upon because the others are wondering, well, what is it that you see that I don't see? Because would you think that not everyone's going to see this psychopath or this pathological the same way in the same situation? So some people would have an easier time recognizing?
Well, that's what happens. I mean, Robert Hare said it's a disorder of social hiding. That it's a disorder that hides well. And even in a personal or intimate relationship, that when women finally get kind of an inkling that something is wrong, not just in the relationship, but with him, a lot of times she does not get a lot of support for that belief system. And again, it takes a while for people, especially if they haven't been run over or cut off at the knees by the pathological, they are less likely to be able to see the evidence of that. And so a lot of times, people do not see them. And like Harrison said, they're charming. A lot of them are bright. They're aggressive. Some of them have done super well. in their careers and in business, and what's not to like from the surface. It's not until people are, get sawed off at the knees with these guys that, they realize that. But when we were talking about when Harrison had mentioned a couple of the traits in pathology, the three that really that I always bend my ear to listen for in someone's story is pathology and the permanence of the disorder are associated with the inability to grow to really any emotional or spiritual depth. These people are incredibly shallow. Harrison referred to it as, this chronic narcissism kind of thing that you can scratch the surface. I call them deepest formica. You scratch the surface and you're already through. You're already through to the other side. So the inability to have any emotional or spiritual depth, the inability to sustain positive change. And that's really the one right there where if women are wanting to look in their relationships, they can look and often spot that when there's a problem in the relationship and it's addressed, and like Harrison said, they don't take responsibility for it. But they may give lip service to it and say, I'm going to go to counseling. Okay, I'll work on that. I'll change that. But 2 weeks, 6 weeks, maybe a couple months at the max, and then the behavior returns back to what it was previously. I call it the rubber band theory, that you stretch the rubber band out, but it always snaps back. And so when women are wondering, is this person pathological, the consistent inability to sustain positive change is one of the things that I look for. And then the other one is the inability to develop insight about how their negative behavior affects other people. And those three, to me, are kind of the hallmarks. I mean, there's lots of behaviors in the personality, in the whole spectrum of all the disorders that fall under that, but those three kind of stand out. And Harrison, if you can talk a little bit about the empathy issue with them.
Well, yeah, there's something I wanted to go into that kind of gets into the empathy issue. I think one of the reasons that pathology remains hidden and why there are so many people that don't see it, mainly those that haven't experienced it, is because just as pathology is hidden, I think that in our culture, our emotions and our emotional being is really hidden. And we're really not aware of what goes on in our emotions at all, for the most part, I think. And when we look at this, I think it's kind of helpful to go into some science. Like if you think about the brain and the different systems of the brain, how there's the sensory motor system, and there's the limbic or the emotional system, and then there's the cortex, the thinking part, the higher centers of the brain. But if you look at that mammalian, the part that's in all mammals, the emotional part of the brain, that's really the key to the pathology, I think. It's like when pretty much everyone is aware of and recognizes that there are, let's say, genetic or just disorders of the mind and the body. So let's say, a baby can be born without certain limbs, without certain organs, or a baby may be born with some kind of defect in their brain that leads to learning disabilities or language problems. And so we're really familiar, and we don't really question at all the idea of these intellectual or physical problems of birth, but we don't really pay attention to the idea or even the possibility of emotional problems. And that's what psychopathy, for example, is. At the root, it's a psychological hole. It's an emotional hole in these people. And it's really, that's the essential part about empathy. Because if you look at animals And animals, for the most part, are where we've inherited our emotional, all of our emotions, all of our emotional being is from animals. If we observe animals, we see the way they interact. We see the nurturing for the young. We see playing behaviors. We see shame. We see people doing, or animals that do something wrong, and so there are certain behaviors that are right and wrong, and then if you break a social rule, you feel shame, and there's punishment, and there's love, and there's all these different emotions that happen between animals, and it's a social thing. These emotions that animals feel and that we feel as a result, they're a function of that self-other relationship. It's how we interact with each other. And without that emotional being, without those emotions driving us and pushing and pulling us away from each other, there would be no social harmony, and we'd get nothing done, basically. Empathy is at the root of what it means to be human. And so when you look at a psychopath has no empathy. It's as if they completely lack that ability for social emotions. Now, what Lobachevsky says in Political Ponerology, he describes it as as a psychological deficit. It's a deficit of instinct. So it's like whatever is a part of us when we're conceived and when we grow in utero, and then when we're born, whatever part determines that emotional structure and the expressed through and by the emotional centers in the brain. There's something that's wrong there, that's lacking, and so when they interact with other people, they just take their emotions and the social emotions that we feel for each other and that drive our social lives. They take that for granted, and they're not really aware of it. So we just kind of assume that everyone operates the same way. So when we interact with a psychopath, we see them, and they might act strange, and we might have this little instinct that something's not right with them. But because we've got this belief that everyone is the same and everyone feels and reacts the same way to these different social situations, we completely miss them. And so that's the thing.
I've talked about that the women project onto the psychopath or any of the other types of personality disorders their own normality, and they believe that everyone sees the world through who they are. They see the psychopath even through who they are. So they're open, they're giving, they're caring. They, for the most part, are honest and tell the truth, and so they project those traits onto them and do not see what's projected. And I like what you were talking about, those deficits, that the best place to see all the things that did not correctly develop in the pathological is in the relationship. I mean, starting with the bonding and attachment. The women, bond, and these guys superficially attach. And even without bonding is empathy, possible. So so the issue of empathy in these relationships is often huge, and it's what I refer to as inevitable harm, because when people have low or no conscience, low or no guilt, low or no empathy, people who have normal amounts are inevitably going to be harmed by that. And I think that's where the dynamics in the relationship part just get, where the women get so hurt. But I want to take a minute, if I can, just to kind of try to tie this in to the domestic violence piece, since this is Domestic Violence Month, and about the impulse control problems that are often inherent in these disorders. Harrison, do you want to touch on that, about the impulse control problems?
Well, how about you start off with that, and then I'll add my thoughts.
Okay. Well, one of the things that that has really helped us with domestic violence, understanding the issue about domestic violence, is the information on neuroscience that has come out over the last decade, I guess, and that all abusers are not created equal. Some of them have the capacity for change based on that they are not pathological and don't have some of the permanent personality deficits and even the neuro stuff, that we now see in some of the chronic relapsing abusers. In fact, I mean, women who are in domestic violence situations, the more times that there is violence, the closer to 100% it moves towards that the person does most likely have pathology or personality disorder. And what we learned from the neuroscience thing is there's at least 4 different brain regions that are impacted by the impulse control problem. And so while we think that this is kind of willful behavior, that the reason he hits is only because of the power and control wheel that we've all been taught, then he can stop hitting. And I think examples of like O.J. Simpson, Mike Tyson are such, real clear pictures of the impulse control problems that are inherent in someone who's pathological. I think we can agree that these guys are up and beyond your sort of average abuser, and that the impulse control regions of the brain that are affected is what I believe makes these people so chronically at risk for violence.
Mm-hmm. And why is it so hard, Sandra? Why is it so hard for some of us to leave a relationship like that with someone who is, comes across very charming, very, maybe to the outside world he looks like the greatest thing since sliced bread, and people,
Mm-hmm.
Get a different perception of this person until they get behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm.
Or do we often see it that way? Is it always happening behind closed doors, or does it just kind of gradually come out?
Mm-hmm. Well, 2 things. First of all, I think most of the women have continued to change or continue to stay because they believed he could change, and that they are not given pathology education. It's my big beef about domestic violence. If we have Domestic Violence Month, we might as well talk about Sandy's beef with domestic violence, which is the power and the control wheel help to define some of the external situations that impact domestic violence. But the women still believe that he has a capacity for change. And some of them do, but some of them don't. And the ones that don't, if she does not have that information, then she will continue to believe it's willful behavior. And she will continue to try other avenues with him, like counseling, batterer intervention, anger management, medication, whatever. And I think, I think our outcomes in people returning to those relationships are so astronomically higher than regular domestic violence programs. I mean, the percentage of the women that go through the Institute's program is so minuscule, which just talks about the power that when women get the education about what pathology is and the permanence of the disorder, and that we can so identify these guys' patterns of behavior in the past, in their current relationship, and even predict the future with what they're going to do in the relationship because they don't change.
How do you assess
we get
that?
a lot of women out.
How do you assess whether the person can change or not? I mean, if they're not into therapy or they haven't been mentally assessed, can you I'm sure with your experience you can see them coming like with lights on. But the average person, how would you be able to assess whether that person can really change or if they are truly a pathological?
Right. Well, when the women come here to put that issue to rest, we have a checklist of symptoms. We don't tell them what the symptoms are associated with. We give them a blank sheet of symptoms, and they go through and check off all that apply, and they're right out of the diagnostic mental health manual. And so once they've checked them out, we can tell them the criteria that they checked off for the person, which mental health, pathological mental health issues they just checked off for them. But people can go online. I mean, women can Google narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, or psychopaths, and get a behavioral trait list, to look at to see if they think.
But do we really want to believe them? Do you see women who go through that checklist and they're faced with the reality and it's staring them right in the face, and yet they go, oh, but I love him. They may still love him. That's not something that fades right away. But the pathology education that goes with it, it creates this paradigm shift in them. I mean, women really turn a corner when they have the information about who can change and who can't. And I think that is and has been key for us. Sure, they're gonna still fall in love or be in love. It takes a while for them to be able to reconcile the illusion of who they thought they were in a relationship with. They were not in love with who they thought they were in love with. Because these guys hide who they really are. I mean, that's the whole mask of sanity, the whole Jekyll and Hyde piece where he's good, he's bad, he's good, he's bad. And they're charming. If they were all Satan, if they only showed up with all the bad traits and none of the good, the women would have an easier time leaving. But it is this ping-ponging back and forth between the good and charming and fun aspects of the guy and the damaging, horrible, hidden life part of that. And so the more information that they get about his behaviors, the relationship dynamics in these kinds of relationships, and the permanence of his disorder, the more it helps them get on the reality page about what's really happening. At what age do you think these traits start coming out? In childhood, teenage years, puberty, or how would you recognize it, and can you divert it? Can you divert someone from turning into a pathological or psychopath or a narcissist? Is that able to be diverted in the child's environment or the way that they're brought up, or is it just something that parents are going to have to deal with? Harrison, what do you think about the early dynamics of that?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that the traits are there from the very beginning. Now, of course, they won't all be there because the child has to go through some development. But I think it probably starts with the attachment phase because it's a this is just what I think. I don't know if there's a scientific consensus on this, but the way I see psychopathy and other personality disorders is that it's basically hardwired into you, and there's not a lot. There's nothing that can change that. The only thing that can really change is how that personality disorder is expressed. So I think it probably starts with attachment because if you're lacking this capacity for social emotion, then you won't respond at all normally to your mother or to anyone really in that attachment phase. And so then, as you get a bit older, you develop all the normal intellectual, mental, cognitive abilities, but because that emotion's lacking, that's when things start to come out. And if you read a little bit on the literature of psychopaths, you'll find that it's called there's what the scientists say, there's like an association or correlation between conduct disorder as a youth and psychopathy as an adult. Now, I think that these scientific terms, they're really just they're there for certain, let's say, like politically correct reasons. Like conduct disorder is really just the name for psychopathy in youth. And so from a really young age, you get behavioral problems, violence, precocious sexuality. You get animal abuse, and from a very young age. This is one of the interesting things that Harrison Koehli wrote about in his first book on psychopathy, and then it was really well described in a novel by Mary Astor called The Incredible Charlie Carew. And that was a story. Charlie in this story was a psychopath, and it's kind of a novel about this man's life from when he's a child to when he's an adult. And and Koehli called him the prototypical psychopath. He recommended that anyone involved in mental health, all psychiatrists, should read this novel because it's such a good portrayal of a psychopath. Mm-hmm. And so as a child, it showed him, and it's really kind of a revelation reading this, because as a child, you can see this boy, and let's say he does something wrong, so his father calls him into the office. And, his father's trying really hard to, on the one hand, his father feels bad because he's got to punish his son. On the other hand, he's trying to be strong because he knows that he's got to do something about this. And all the while this is happening, the boy Charlie can kind of see all these things that are happening. He's saying, okay, well, yeah, I see my father. He's trying to. He feels bad because he's hurting my feelings, and he's not quite sure how to discipline me. And so throughout this, Charlie decides like the best thing to do would be to cry, because he knows his father will react well to that. So he puts on these crocodile tears and cries and says, "Oh, I understand, Papa, and I'll never do it again." And then later on he goes up into his room and he does some practicing in front of the mirror. He's like, okay, well, how will I respond to this situation? And so he puts on a certain facial expression, and he's like, okay, no, that's not the right one. And so that's the reality of psychopathy, is that these people lack the normal emotions that we all feel. And so that's
they learn to mimic and parrot.
What's that?
They learn to mimic and parrot.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's essentially that children are born with this? Is this something that a child is born with, like a birth defect or a handicap or something like that?
Yeah.
And that's the idea I was trying to get across, where exactly like you said, like a birth defect or a handicap, it's like we automatically just accept intellectual and physical handicaps like this, but we have such a hard time accepting that these handicaps exist in the emotional sphere, and
when you think about that the emotional deficits happen in childhood, and I've seen children diagnosed as early as 4. It's usually, a lot older, and like Harrison said, they have to miss some of the emotional milestones where you start getting some of the conduct that it starts to be an indicator of that. But they just learn really early on to mimic and parrot back, and so the psychopath, they believe, is born that way. Sociopaths have more of the nature versus nurture argument, where the sociopaths may have been brought up in abuse and neglect, some other kind of trauma, or by other pathological parents that have influence on it. But when you think about that, whatever level of whatever type of pathology they have, that it begins in childhood. So by the time someone's dating him, at 19, 20, 25, 30 years old, this guy has had a lot of time in order to get down the mimic and parroting, where he can pass off, at least initially, as having a normal range of emotion. And I think that's a scary thing for women, is they come to the Institute because they are scared to death they're going to pick this way again, that these guys are so good at disguising the disorder until they're in a relationship with them, that they're very afraid.
How often do you see, how often do you see it the other direction, where it's the woman who is the pathological? And, I know that, that you and Susan both deal directly, mostly with women. How often is it seen the other direction?
It is, and because we mostly work with women, that's why we phrase it that way. But pathology is not a gender issue; it's a mental health issue. And so, yes, a lot of the women are often underdiagnosed and misdiagnosed. Women who actually are psychopaths or have psychopathic features are often underdiagnosed with other types of disorders, borderline or bipolar or whatever. And I don't know, for me, in some ways the women are scarier for me. They're sneakier. They're just, I'd rather go up against a male psychopath anytime than a female. It just scares me. Yes. So.
Well, you gave an example of like Ted Bundy. What, looking through history or something, who would you put up as an example of a female psychopath?
I've got a perfect one. If I can jump in here.
Yeah, sure.
Well, this woman, I think, she's alive, and I think she's one of the most dangerous people on the planet, and her name is Sarah Palin. Now, you might wonder where that's coming from, but I've done a bunch of reading lately, and from all appearances, from everything that I can read, Sarah Palin appears to me to be just a totally typical psychopath. Now, and that's a scary thing, and it's hard to believe, because she just looks like a kind of silly, friendly.
Soccer mom.
Yeah, soccer mom, right? But that's the image that she portrays. That's the image she consciously puts out there. And if you read about, there was a great article just recently. I forget the name of it, but it was this guy wrote it. He went around interviewing everyone he could find who'd ever known her, and he discovered the strangest thing is that most people, almost everyone that he talked to, was terrified of telling him anything. A lot of them wouldn't even speak off directly.
It sounds like the Clintons.
Mm-hmm. And it was because she had such a reputation. She would, like behind closed doors, she'd threaten people. Like she'd say, if you say anything about me, if you say anything, you know what I can do. I can ruin you. And just behind the scenes, she was this terror that just she terrifies people. And people are still even years after interacting with her, even when she's off doing her thing now, she's no longer in the same environment that she was. People are still terrified of her. And
you're not giving just your political opinion. You're looking at this from a scientific standpoint.
Well, I mean, that brings up the point that people have these preconceived ideas about who's pathological and who's not. I talked about in the book that everybody thinks that it's on the male version that it's Charlie Manson, with a swastika between his eyes. Well, if they all came marked like that, we wouldn't need pathology education,
Right.
But that we have these preconceived ideas about what pathology is, and Harrison writes a lot about pathology in the political realm, about how we get kind of blindsided with our own political opinions when, if we like Sarah, we would never think Sarah's, pathological, which is, has impacted, I think, our country through the White House in many, many ways because there's lots of pathologicals in Washington.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just add one thing, what I think is probably the most important point of Dr. Lobachevsky's book. What the book is about is basically all the processes, all of the parts that get put together in a society to lead towards basically what's been called a totalitarian government. Because Lobachevsky lived in Poland. He was a Polish man, and so he lived through the Nazi invasion and occupation, and then the Soviet takeover, and so he lived through communism for all those years. And so that's what that was the impulse for writing this book, and for all the processes that lead to that final step, where we have a closed society led by a pathological elite that just terrorizes the population. He said the first criterion for that process, the first sign that that's going to happen, is the inability to recognize pathology in your own group.
That's interesting.
And so that's very dangerous. And so when I go online and I see the people defending Sarah Palin just because she's Sarah Palin and because I'll support her right or wrong and you've got to be lying because that can't possibly be true, that's the first criterion for these kinds of things to happen. That gives a pathological the support, the network that they need to be able to do what they do. And that's so if you look to even all the cliched examples from history, if you look at Hitler, Hitler couldn't have done what he did without the support of people who didn't realize what he was really like.
What he was, right.
And that's what, and we've seen that in American politics a lot. I'd say that from what I can tell, Lyndon Johnson seemed like a psychopath to me. Bill Clinton had some psychopathic traits. I don't know if he was a complete psychopath or not. I don't know enough about him. George Bush definitely had some things wrong with him.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, he was a psychopath. But then,
I don't know if he was smart enough to be a psychopath.
Well,
I mean, I know it's not based on IQ, but good God, he gives psychopaths a bad name.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of the most dangerous people in politics are the ones that operate behind the scenes. Those are the ones that those are the people, the psychopaths with the most intelligence, the most control over themselves, and the greatest ambitions towards power. And and they're smart enough not to get involved and not to put themselves way out there in the public. They're smart enough that they can, whoever's in politics, they can push their buttons. They can convince them, coerce them one way or another to do what they want them to do. And those guys are the most dangerous. Those are the guys in the let's say, well, first of all, in the corporations and in the economic world, they're the ones. The foreign policy, like the steering groups,
And we see the same thing even in personal relationships. I mean, some of what Susan does, and then we've done a little bit of this on legal retreats when the women come to talk about these high conflict cases. One of the girls that was just here, 67 times in court. And so the inability for people to spot them, just like Harrison says, when they lay low, instead of being out in the spotlight, and even in the personal relationships when women are going to court over and over and over again for restraining orders that have been violated or custody or divorce hearings, and the less emotionally reactive the guy is, the more normal and the more his pathology can fly under the radar. And then the more hysterical she looks. So she's the one that starts looking pathological I think the same tactic works in court. That when these guys or women, when they learn to lay low and stay out of the limelight, they get away with a horrendous amount of things.
So you think there's a real misunderstanding even within the court system that it's not recognizing?
No, it isn't.
Yeah.
It's not recognized. Part of what the Institute has been trying to do is do training within the legal system and the judicial system, which brings me kind of up to the point as we're getting towards the end of the show, is that yes, the judicial system definitely does not have a clue about pathology. It's like they separate. They understand, criminal and criminal mindset, but they don't somehow connect it to the chronic, ongoing problems. When we ask, who does that? Who rapes? Who murders? Who child abducts? Who stalks? Who has chronic repeating domestic violence problem? Who is that? If we stop just calling it an abuser, or we just stop saying some generic title to that, and we keep asking the question, who? And what are the disorders most associated with the most violent acts, and we come down to this pool or pit of pathology, as I say, that points to this ongoing cluster of disorders. If domestic violence and the court system ever wants to really get a handle on this, they've got to start looking at the issue about pathology and separating out, stop wasting our time and tax dollars and resources on the pathologicals that can't change, and start putting the money into victim education so these women stop picking these types and put the dollars into men that actually, and women, that actually can change. And we're missing it.
I think we're also missing some things, too, where, the lethality assessments are very, very good. However, what steps are being done after a lethality assessment is done? Where are we taking it at that point within the court system? And we might not have time for you to answer that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, we're actually this month during October, we're going to talk about high conflict cases and pathology in the courts and stuff like that. So we'll pick up and talk about that.
And I hope everybody will tune in all through the month as we do pick through different topics and go a little bit more in depth of recognizing and what to do, how to get out. And Sandra, we've got about a minute left. If you and Harrison would like to go ahead and wrap up, and then we'll close the show.
Harrison, is there any last points on pathology you want to make?
The only thing I want to say is that I would highly recommend for anyone in a situation of domestic violence or involved with a pathological or even out of a relationship with one to really try out and get into a stress reduction program that stimulates your vagus nerve. And I actually do one every day called Eru Olas, and it's actually developed by Laura Knight-Yachik, whose books Red Pill Press publishes. So if you go to redpillpress.com, we've actually got it available there, and it's great because it utilizes your body's own knowledge of how to reduce stress, and that is the vagus, that parasympathetic nervous system. So try it out,
and the women definitely need that.
Well, I want to say thank you to Harrison for joining us. Remember, during the month of October, Susan will be on the road hosting the shows until she returns. Is going to be Sandra Brown, the author of How to Spot a Dangerous Man and the CEO of the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. So much of what goes on in leaving an abusive relationship has to do with fear. What will happen to me? Who will take care of and love me? These were questions in everyone's mind as they remain in their abusive relationship. Recognize that if abuse happens once, it happens again. So know it and get away from it. Someone will be on the other side to help you, but most importantly, learn to love yourself. Don't be discouraged. It's often the last key in the bunch that opens the lock. Nobody trips over mountains. It's the small pebble that causes you to stumble. Pass all the pebbles in your path, and you'll find you've crossed the mountain. And remember to tune in on Monday nights for Intimate Partner Homicide Investigations, and then Tuesday nights is Crime Wire. You can go to Safe Relationships Magazine and order Sandra's book, Susan's books, and Sandra, it's been great, and we will see you next week.
Everyone be safe. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Harrison.
Thank you. That was fun.